Well, hello. Welcome to DTLT Today. We've been struggling here for about the past 30 minutes.
It has not been a smooth ride.
It's not, but hey, at least we've got the camera and some semblance of a microphone here and stuff, so we've got it going on. I pulled it together last minute, but
Episode 99 has proven to be.
Yeah.
I got 99 episodes, but this ain't one.
this ain't one. But tomorrow's going to be the big one. I promise you that. Tomorrow is episode 100.
100.
Yeah, we've got to put our heads together and think of something big.
I thought the cake. Are we going to have the cake and
We'll
the
have,
birthday?
we'll have the cake.
What we
can
need
a
to
little
do
birthday
tomorrow is we need
celebration.
to do a retrospective of the best episodes.
Yeah, that's
what
true.
we thought were of the first 100.
I agree.
What were the?
Well-
what would we rank as the 5 best?
What we'll have to do is we'll have to ask the audience to tell us what ones they liked. Maybe we'll pull it out on Twitter, put a post out, and just say, point us to what were your favorite moments in DTLT. And of course,
Yeah.
we know people like 1% Yellow have watched every episode, so she
Yeah,
should be
there are
able to...
very few
Yeah.
who can speak to all of them. I
Right.
can't even speak to all. I didn't watch all of them.
No, me neither. Yeah, I never watch
I watched
you.
a lot of them. You never what?
I never watch you.
I never
if I'm
liked
not,
you.
If I'm not here, what's the point?
I never liked you.
So, this episode's not going to be too long. What I wanted to talk about was something that I actually blogged about recently, and we've talked a little bit about this actually way back when. We've talked about copyright multiple times on the show.
Yeah,
but
Kinda Blue.
We were
Remember
talking
that?
about Kind of Bloop, or whatever, which Andy Bayo was involved in. Probably one of the first 10 episodes, maybe. I'd have to go back
That's
and
right.
look.
Well,
but it was
also
way
the
early
other
on.
one we talked about that was early on was the that dude up at MIT who tried to steal all those journals and make them open access.
Aaron Schwartz.
Aaron Schwartz. That's
Or
right.
Swartz,
We
but
talked
yeah.
about that very early. Maybe that was like the second or third episode.
It's really early on. So.
Copyright's an ongoing issue in this field, right?
yeah.
We can't get away from it.
Right, exactly. And, you know, one thing we're finding more and more, and it's a little bit of what Andy talks about in his post, Andy Bayo, not Andy Rush, because Andy Rush doesn't blog.
And Scott Baio is no relationship to Andy Baio.
No.
And Andy Rush nor Scott Baio blog anymore.
But he talks about this idea of a younger generation that just doesn't get copyright law, doesn't understand what the big deal is. And we see this all the time with like the video essay that DS106 does.
Yeah.
And you do these video essays and people post them on YouTube and it immediately gets pulled down because it's from a major motion picture.
That's
Even
right.
though all the audio is taken out or it's very low and they're actually talking and doing commentary over it.
Yeah.
Even though they're in a higher ed institution and you're talking fair use rights, it doesn't matter. That stuff
No.
just gets pulled automatically.
Yeah, Google and YouTube specifically become the arbiters of copyright in that
Yeah.
regard. And it's kind of like guilty until proven innocent.
Well, and it's kind of sad because the only answer we have for them really at this point is try Blip, try Vimeo. You know,
Yeah.
go to some other service and it might not get pulled.
You know, one thing, and I'll bring this up inside and then we'll go on, but Michael Branson Smith actually challenged one once
Did
and
he?
won.
Yeah.
Because my students, and I was afraid to tell them to challenge them, in the event they challenged them, and then they went back and
End up in a court of law.
ended in the court. I don't want my
Yeah.
students to get sued.
Right.
So I'm like, we can find another way, like Vimeo or Blip. But otherwise,
Well, it's the reality of the situation is you have companies claiming copyright on stuff that simply isn't. Now there are some stuff that is. Much of what you post often, you know, is.
Is,
You know, it
absolutely.
very much is. But there have been times that I've pulled down videos from archive.org that are public domain. And then I've done something, I've remixed them and put them on YouTube. They immediately get pulled because YouTube has a system where it can, I guess, it looks at fingerprint information
but the whole
on the
thing
data
is
itself.
anyone can blow the whistle on that video, and YouTube automatically assumes you're guilty.
Sure.
And so there's the problem with
Exactly.
YouTube's whole process. It's
Right.
like there's no due process.
Yeah.
It's purely like if someone even mentions the word copyright, which is kind of how this culture's begun, everyone gets afraid, which is why I love what you've been talking about with this Andy Bayo thing. Is like the new generation is kind of like, look, we're not trying to break copyright. Let's
No.
just be upfront about that. But that's all they do.
Yeah, the post is
Which I
called,
love.
the post, which I'll put in the show notes, is called "No Copyright Intended." Right, and it's sort of this byline. It's this tag that people have been putting on their videos. He actually searched for phrases around that same idea on YouTube and found almost 500,000 videos where people say, "Hey, don't sue, no copyright intended. I don't mean to be messing in your field," or something like that. And the reality, I mean, you and I know that's not really going to stop YouTube from pulling a video. I mean, if a company wants to pull a video down, they are.
They will.
But
yeah.
it is a really good indicator for the kind of thinking that this generation has, that really, that what I'm doing should not be illegal.
That's
I don't
right.
feel it's illegal, and I should. It's not the same like when you talk about laws on pot smoking or something. In the back of people's heads, there are a lot of people, even in the younger generation, who still feel like that might be wrong. I don't know if that's wrong or not, but that might be wrong. But copyright, completely out of the water. They just don't understand why it should ever be wrong.
Yeah.
They've grown up to believe that it shouldn't be.
Well, when you think about a culture that's doing so much of their work online and sharing so much of themselves online, that you start having these corporations come in and saying, look, you are or are not able to share this part of you with someone else. And let's face it, pop culture becomes a part of us very quickly. I could see why there's going to be a far more vicarious and vicious reaction
Right.
to that kind of litigation as this culture and as this generation grows up.
That was the interesting thing that he said. What happens when you've got a group of people who don't believe that this is wrong, that then become a voting age, and then they have the
Absolutely.
power to elect officials, and
Yeah.
that becomes a really powerful, or it can be a really powerful thing. I don't say it automatically becomes, because
Yeah.
it very well could not, but it's an interesting idea, and he makes a really good parallel to the Prohibition area, because I mean, neither of us were alive during it, but everybody knew during the Prohibition, everybody was still drinking. It was like Prohibition didn't stop drinking. Okay, it made it more difficult in some respects, but everybody was still drinking, and you had these fringe groups that were calling for sobriety, that were calling for temperance.
Yeah.
And he's saying remix culture is the new Prohibition, and the only people calling for temperance are the media corporations.
That's right.
Those are the ones saying that this is the way it should be, and everyone else says, I don't really understand why you think this is wrong, but I definitely don't feel it is, and I'm going to keep doing it.
And if you think about what happened in the Prohibition era, and I'm actually very fascinated right now by the 20s, not only because of the recession or what many people talk to as the Second Great Depression we just went through and are still in to some degree, I think to some great degree, since 2008, but also that moment in which you had an entire culture basically prohibit one of the main kind of entertainment pastimes like alcohol.
Right.
And what that meant. And what's fascinating is Boardwalk Empire deals with the underside and the seedy side of that whole notion of prohibition, and just how all this organized crime rose out of it, and how the actual notion of prohibition is in many ways doing what many people have already said. You're basically criminalizing your entire population.
Right.
And it's not sustainable, just like prohibition wasn't sustainable. And, people are dragging their feet on copyright. We see, though, that rather than saying it's going to change and sit back, we see laws like SOPA, which is really all the talk right now, and how draconian that is in relationship to larger questions of copyright and sharing. I mean, we're in a very interesting time, but if you look at the political structure within which we operate, not only for the movements like Occupy and banks and bailouts, but also for copyright, my kind of ongoing thing with Andy and other people is I don't see this two-party system as it stands.
Yeah.
And its current incarnation with the current people elected and the current benefits they get out of it to really change it. Just on Boing Boing the other day, they talked about how many kickbacks congressmen are getting and women are getting and going to lobby industries for the MPAA, the RIA, and all these major media companies. I mean, they're kind of the congresswomen and senators, where they make their money when they retire from that is in these kind of lobbyist groups that are multi-billion-dollar kind of companies that are trying to control the law.
And that's why I hate
It's just insane.
And that's why I hate to be cynical. I want to believe that some of the stuff that that Andy's talking about in this post about the idea that when a majority of the electorate is, is from this new generation, that they could exhibit change. But like Noise Professor's in the chat, and he's saying that this idea is sustainable as long as elections are bought and paid for by mega corporations. And
I absolutely agree with that.
You wonder, even with the majority of the electorate, how much change can do you good when you can't even get the right officials elected, when you can't even get officials to run for office that could affect that kind of change in its current system.
Yeah, and the really negative part of that change is, the idea that we have these copyright issues emerge, and you have these questions about stealing and intellectual property and theft, but then you see the limits which these corporations are willing to go to compromise all personal freedoms and notions of privacy to get at this. And that's really the tension. The tension is sharing or breaking copyright bad or good. The tension is, at what point are we willing to compromise all notions of privacy and some kind of constitutional rights to freedoms for supporting, and I think in many ways bailing out once again corporations when it comes to this notion of the digital age and sharing, because they haven't gotten their head around it.
Right.
And so what they're asking for is basically the company to litigate and scare the hell out of its people until they figure out a way, if they even care to.
Yeah.
Because if they can run it through fear, they would never care to. And in the process, it's the American people, and people of all cultures, I imagine, but it's American people, particularly under this regime, that is being criminalized and also being, I think, repressed based on some serious kind of personal liberties. Yeah. I mean, this is a question ultimately of liberties, and I think that's where the Pirate Party really, and I know Zach has mentioned this, the Pirate Party is all about that. Pirate Party isn't giving you the rights to steal. Pirate Party is all about preserving these liberties that companies like, or lobby groups like the RIA or the MPA are in many ways trying to kind of rip from under us. I mean, it's an interesting battle that the pirate part of it, just like the pirate box, doesn't entirely get to it because immediately it has that association like the term blogging does. Oh, it's just cats. Oh, it's just politics. Pirate, it's just stealing. Right. But no, it's actually absolutely about civil liberties.
Well, and it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, we're still in the infancy of this age where people can actually remix content, put it online, and publish for themselves. I mean, you look at what Napster did back in the late 90s, and then now what YouTube is doing for video, Napster did for music. And so, and that's just 10 years. I mean, that's nothing in the larger frame of time. So, I have to believe that even if we can't get officials elected that can change these laws, no one's going to follow them, and more people are going to become interested in being a part of this culture that's able to publish, that's able to remix. It wasn't the case 20 years ago where people understood this enough to give a damn, and now they do, and now some people do. Not that I hate to make it an age thing, but in many ways it is. It's just a general thing where the younger generations are just going to grow up in this. They're not even going to understand it, and they're just going to do it.
What's crazy, though, and David Wiley tweeted out a link to this. He said the only people who are maybe more kind of insane than the academic publishing industry is the music industry, the music recording industry, and that has still proven true. I mean, they are still, despite all the failures they've had at going after students in universities and doing those cease and desist, they are still at it. Yeah. And it doesn't seem like I got the message at all. Same with the, MPAA or the Motion Picture Association. I mean, these folks are not letting go.
But there's going to be...
And they have billions of dollars to spend. Right. And they have inroads with, litigation that we are seeing being presented to the Congress and the Senate right now.
Yeah.
I mean, and I like the idea of these kids are going to grow up and they're going to be angry. And I want to say, no, we've seen some of that with Occupy Wall Street. This is not my generation doing it. This is another generation. I hope that kind of logic extends not only from, the idea of bailouts and student loans and all that, but also to the very crux of this argument, I think, which is, the corporatization of culture.
Yeah.
Where you have no more real sense of ownership of any parts of the culture that's being produced.
Right.
And that's a bigger question, and whether or not, it's just going to be some mass progressive movement that's going to get us out of that. I mean, I want to believe that's what it's going to take, but we'll see. You know, again, it's a question.
Well, now, speaking of copyright, you had something that you wanted to bring up, which was something pointed out to us recently, just in terms of higher ed and fair use of images.
Well, yeah. I blogged today that, and this is actually just an email, a press release email that someone sent to me, Marjorie Ock, who's an art historian here at Mary Washington, and it was actually the Visual Resources Association, which I didn't even know exist, have actually put out a statement about ways in which fair use needs to be employed for reusing and using visual images
Right.
for educational and cultural purposes. And there's 6 basic mandates, and I'll read the last 3 through 6, which I think are awesome. And this is basically the Visual Resources Association. This is the Committee on Copyright. Came out with a statement. And the statement reads like, look, we're kind of tired of, they don't say this, but this is how I read it. Like, we need to make a more assertive kind of stance on copyright so that the very disciplines we're trying to teach aren't dictated on how we teach them by these corporations who are claiming copyright and everything. And you would imagine that the Moving Image Association should follow suit and say the same thing, which would kind of really put a lot of pressure on YouTube, I imagine.
Yeah.
But here's the 3rd through the 6th kind of points that they make that I love. The 6 uses, and here's use 3 through 6. 3, use of images, both large, high-resolution images and thumbnails, on course websites and in other online study materials. That should be freely available. I love that. We go through that right now with that Venice exhibit. 4, adaptations of images for teaching and classroom work by students. Cutting them up, remixing them, adapting them. 5, sharing images among educational and cultural institutes to facilitate teaching and study. Sharing images across institutions. I mean, yes! What sharing? You're going to actually talk about sharing in this freaking thing? It's awesome.
Yeah.
6, reproduction of images and thesis and dissertations. So, just, you can read the whole thing online. It's Visual Resources Association. This is a big thing they put out. But I'm really fascinated, and it's like one of the few kind of moments of hope, especially after Georgia Tech and screaming about FERPA and personalization and privacy taking everything down. Here's an example of the Visual Resources Association coming out and saying, look, here's 6 basic uses.
Here's the thing, though. What we need more so than a press release is we need precedents. We need a university that's willing to go to bat for that by going to court. Because unfortunately, a press release does nothing for a judge that's trying to decide whether you were right or wrong. Whereas, if we had some solid cases of fair use precedents, then I feel like, institutions as a whole would be able to point back to it. Then they had lawyers look at this,
Yeah, but that's the idea. Is like, I agree with you, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that an art historian is sending us this,
Right.
who we work with, to build an exhibit online to use these images, maybe it emboldens some professors now to say, hey, we need to do this, we need to try this. And we've already been doing a lot of this, but wouldn't it be great if we weren't always kind of like hiding behind the cuddle couch worrying if there's going to be, copyright police coming, but we're just like, no, we believe this is fair use. We believe this is our culture. We believe we serve the higher purpose of educating a population so they can be responsible citizens. And part of that is understanding the culture within which they exist. If you can't even get to that, then the corporatization of culture has basically isolated you from the means from which you can understand the space you're in. Yeah. And that's what copyright law has ultimately become. And I don't think it's ever meant to be that. But because it's being taken to the nth degree and the time in which it's being used has been elongated so much, and elongated is the wrong word there, but drawn out so much, that we're really in a kind of crisis.
And I've got to give a big shout out to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, because really when you talk about groups that are fighting the fight for this kind of stuff and actually spending real money in order to make those precedent cases, that's the biggest one. The EFF is pretty much out there taking donations to be able to fight this kind of stuff in court, show precedents, back up the little guys, and make sure that there are some solid cases to do that. And I just hope that more of that happens.
And I think it's the Electronic Frontier is definitely doing that, but I think the point Zach makes in the chat is a good one. Like, at what point is this not also the obligation of the instructor, of the student, of academia in general? And at what point do I always thought this was odd.
Well,
and I
this
know-
this came up in kind of bloop though. It can literally bankrupt a single person. Maybe for an academic institution, they might find it
Yeah.
worth it. But you're talking like over $300,000 to defend yourself. That's not something you can put on a student or a professor.
But as an academic, let's put it this way: you're protected by an institution. That's one of the powers of an institution.
Right.
You're also protected by the state because we're a state institution.
Right.
And so you have tenure, so it's not like you're going to lose your job because of it. So you have all these protections,
Yeah.
which are actually the notion of academia. Like tenure was supposed to protect freedom of expression. And so we have all these people who are in that particular place to do it and have a particular freedoms to exercise, and they are not doing it
Yeah.
by and large, or not doing it openly and really drawing attention to what they're doing and challenging some of the pre-existing kind of notions that you can't do that. And I think I agree with Zach entirely that this is a moral obligation of these centers of culture. And if they're not doing it, in many ways, their reluctance or they're looking the other way, which we're so happy to point out after the fact that everyone else is looking the other way, but here we are in this kind of special privileged space. But we've been looking the other way for copyright over the last 20 years to the point where we find ourselves in these kind of weird positions like Georgia Tech with FERPA. And FERPA, I don't want to conflate FERPA and copyright.
Yeah.
But in my mind, FERPA is part of that use of privacy and that notion of privacy for students that pushes our sharing off the web.
Well, and
So
what-
it has a direct or indirect consequence on bigger notions of copyright and sharing the culture we're part of.
And what's really happened is you've got large corporations, you've got the MPAA and the RIAA who have really done an excellent job of instilling this kind of fear and the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And they've instilled that in the culture enough to the point where people are second guessing. I guess the hope
Everything, yeah.
of this post and the hope of the newer generations is that they're not going to have that same fear because they're just not going to care. And that's my hope, that they won't care and they'll continue to push the limits and say, why the hell should this be wrong? I'm just going to post this and say it's right. And you're going to have to sue, I guess, if you're going to do that. And, like you said, I mean, we as academic institutions can lead the way on that.
Yeah.
We should be
We
leading
could
the
stop.
way.
We could stop it being like this sense of like we hope something happens. Like I feel like that's what academia has been doing a lot as it's become more and more corporate over the last 30 years. Is it's been sitting on the sidelines. It's been too afraid to take a stand,
Right.
and it's losing a lot of what I think made it interesting.
Yeah.
Made it vital. Made it a kind of a voice of protest and a voice of dissension and a voice of the culture that we really needed. Like the academies, I want to believe, had that at some point, but maybe that's me repainting the past. I mean, maybe that never happened in the academy. The academy, in many ways, just kind of really did canonize that behavior rather than actually be the seed of it.
Yeah.
But,
So, I think that's enough for this episode. I think we should tell
Yeah.
our audience both to tune in tomorrow for episode 100.
100.
And hell, maybe remix this video and make something cool out of it.
That's right. Yeah, and then but I do think we've run out of time. But there's a lot. There's probably a number of shows, and maybe we should bring Noise Professor Zach in on one because we talk about the Patriot Act. We could talk about post 9/11 relationships between privacy, national security, and what has that meant for kind of notions of privacy. I mean, notions of copyright, because it's interesting. They all seem separate, like these notions of privacy and copyright and homeland security. But in many ways, after 9/11, they've all seemed to be bundled into the same kind of rhetoric of terrorism, of fear, of all these questions that we've kind of lived under the Bush administration, and Obama hasn't done nearly enough to make us feel like we're outside of.
I'd say that's lobbyists grasping at straws to try and paint their argument
But
in
it's
several
funny
different
because
contexts.
the way a lot of people frame that is always like, this is just it's on its last gasp, and we've been talking about the last gasp of copyright since I started at Mary Washington well before, so that's like 7 years, and they're not gasping. They're making real political inroads to change the constitutional structure of how we share and how we live.
Right.
That's not gasping.
Yeah.
Like, that's really organized and orchestrated, well-funded change that is going to hurt the public. Right? I mean, it's very different than kind of painting them as they're hanging on, but they're gonna that's how all the major people do. Like, how can they compete? How can they ever do it? Like, Clay Shirky and all them are always talking about like that. Like this kind of natural Darwinism system is gonna absolutely root them out. But Darwinism and social Darwinism is a joke. It doesn't exist. Right? There are predefined privileges built into the system.
Well, yeah,
this is not meritocracy.
And they're showing that their business model is not going to die. It's just going to change to one of content creation over to one of litigation.
That's
so
right.
they're just going to, the money that they've lost in terms of content, they're going to make up by suing the hell out of people. Yeah.
And the idea that the
off.
record industry is losing money is something that's, their profits have... They are making record profits.
Right.
So it's not even like, here they are, they have no money and they're putting in the last money they have.
Thanks to digital distribution, which they fought like tooth and nail.
It's absolutely true. So there's a lot always to talk about this. But I think maybe in the future there should be kind of some... I would like to have... Like, we have so many topics. It'd be interesting to go back to the previous 100 episodes, look at some of those topics, and maybe start on a weekly and regular basis... talking about a show that's going to deal with this topic and look at some of what we talked about. Kind of like we tried to do today.
Yeah.
I like that.
A little retrospective action.
Yeah, but also we know maybe a copyright show once a week.
Yeah.
Maybe, not that it has to be that regulated, but,
right.
I find it interesting always to talk about copyright, and I always get excited when I talk about copyright, because it always seems to me like I don't do it on a regular basis, but it seems to me like it's all so much of every question we ask in EdTech and higher ed, that seems to be the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
And no one wants to acknowledge it, but it's always there.
Right.
So
I like getting you excited, Jim.
I like being excited. Doesn't happen nearly a month. Well, it has, man. I've been getting excited a lot. But that's for another episode.
Well, good. Thanks for watching, folks.